Hey guys, tonight we're diving into something a little different. No dramatic coronations, no scandalous love affairs, well, maybe a few, but mostly we're talking about the absolutely exhausting business of running a household in the 18th century. So go ahead and dim the lights, get comfortable, maybe grab that second pillow you've been eyeing. We're going to meander through the daily grind of keeping a house functioning back when everything, and I mean everything, was unreasonably complicated. Now, when we think about the 18th century, we usually picture fancy balls, powdered wigs, maybe some light treason. But behind all that glamour was an entire army of people just trying to keep the household from falling apart. And honestly, it's kind of amazing anyone got anything done. Let's start with the basics. If you were wealthy enough to have a household worth managing, and we're talking about the upper classes here, because peasants had their own special brand of exhaustion we'll get to later, you had what was called a household staff. This wasn't just a cook and a maid, oh no, this was a full hierarchy, basically a small kingdom operating inside your house. At the top, you had the steward or the house steward. This guy was essentially the CEO of your home. He managed all the male servants, handled the finances, paid the bills, and made sure everyone was doing their job. He was usually educated, could read and write, and honestly probably knew more about running your estate than you did. A lot of wealthy families basically handed over the keys and said, "You deal with it, I'm busy being important." Then you had the housekeeper. She was the steward's counterpart, managing all the female servants. She had the keys to literally everything: the linen closet, the pantry, the spice cupboard, and spices were expensive, so this was serious business. She also oversaw cleaning, laundry, and made sure the maids weren't slacking off or, heaven forbid, getting too friendly with the footmen. Speaking of footmen, let's talk about them for a second. Footmen were basically decorative young men. I'm not even joking. They were hired partly for their looks and height. You wanted tall, handsome footmen because they made you look good. They'd stand around looking pretty, serve at dinner, announce guests, and carry things. The pretty boy requirement was so real that families would sometimes measure potential footmen to make sure they were tall enough, because nothing says "I'm wealthy" like a matched set of 6-foot servants in matching livery. And livery, by the way, was the uniform servants wore. Each household had their own colors and style, kind of like a sports team, but with more powdered wigs and less enthusiasm. The fancier the livery, the fancier you were. Some families spent absurd amounts of money dressing up their servants just to show off. But let's get into what actually happened day to day, because that's where it gets really tedious. First, the house had to be kept clean. And in the 18th century, everything got dirty fast. Coal fires for heating meant soot everywhere. Candles for lighting meant wax drippings and smoke. Unpaved streets meant mud tracked in constantly. It was a losing battle, but the maids fought it every single day. Housemaids would start their day around 5 or 6 in the morning, sometimes earlier. Their first job was usually to light the fires in all the main rooms before the family woke up, because nobody wanted to wake up to a cold house. Then they'd haul out the ashes from yesterday's fires. Then they'd start sweeping, dusting, scrubbing floors, polishing brass, beating rugs, all by hand, obviously. Vacuum cleaners wouldn't be a thing for another century or so. And the cleaning standards were intense. Wealthy families expected everything to be spotless. Some housekeepers had the maids scrub floors on their hands and knees daily. Marble floors had to be polished. Wood floors had to be swept and sometimes sanded. Windows had to be cleaned with vinegar and newspaper. Yes, newspaper, because paper towels also weren't a thing. Laundry was its own special nightmare. Doing laundry in the 18th century was basically an Olympic event. It usually happened once a week, sometimes once a month, depending on how much you wanted to torture your laundry maids. The process went like this. First, you'd sort everything. Whites separate, colors separate, delicates separate. Then you'd soak everything overnight in cold water. The next morning, you'd heat up massive amounts of water in big copper kettles over a fire. You'd add lye soap, which was made from ashes and animal fat, so it smelled delightful, I'm sure. Then you'd dump the clothes in, boil them, and stir them around with a big stick, like a horrifying laundry stew. After boiling, you'd pull everything out, scrub the stains by hand on a washboard, rinse everything multiple times, wring it all out, which destroyed your hands because wet linen weighs a ton, and then hang it all up to dry. If it was raining, good luck. You'd have wet laundry draped all over the kitchen and servants' quarters for days. Oh, and ironing. Ironing was done with heavy flat irons that you heated on the stove. You needed multiple irons going at once because they cooled down fast. And if you weren't careful, you'd scorch the fabric or burn yourself. Probably both. All of this for 1 week's worth of laundry. No wonder people didn't change clothes as often back then. It wasn't just about hygiene. It was about not wanting to deal with laundry day. Now let's talk about food, because feeding a household was another full-time job. Actually, several full-time jobs. The kitchen in a big 18th century house was basically a small factory. You had a head cook, assistant cooks, kitchen maids, scullery maids, and sometimes a pastry cook if the family was really fancy. The head cook ran the kitchen with an iron fist. She, and it was usually a woman, though top chefs were often men, planned all the meals, managed the kitchen budget, ordered supplies, and made sure everything was cooked properly and on time. This was not easy because cooking in the 18th century meant using an open hearth or a primitive stove with zero temperature control. Want to roast a chicken? You built a fire, waited for it to get to the right temperature, which you judged by feel, basically, and then hung the chicken on a spit and turned it by hand for an hour. Or you had a spit boy do it, which was exactly what it sounds like. A child whose job was to turn the spit for hours in front of a hot fire. Child labor laws were not a thing. Baking was even trickier because you needed a consistent oven temperature, which was nearly impossible. Some cooks would stick their hand in the oven and count how long they could stand the heat. Oh yes, that's a 3-second oven, perfect for bread. Just casual risk of burns, no big deal. And meals weren't simple. The upper classes expected multiple courses, elaborate dishes, fancy desserts. Dinner, which was usually served in the early afternoon because meal times were weird back then, could be a whole production. You'd have soup, fish, meat dishes, side dishes, removes, which were dishes that replaced other dishes halfway through, and then dessert. All of this had to be cooked, plated, and served at the right temperature in the right order. The scullery maid had probably the worst job in the kitchen. She washed all the dishes, scrubbed all the pots, cleaned the floors, and generally did all the dirty work nobody else wanted to do. She worked in a little room off the kitchen called the scullery, which was usually damp, dark, and smelled like old dishwater. Her hands were constantly raw from being in water all day, and there were a lot of dishes because every course meant more plates, more serving platters, more utensils. Then you had the still room maid. The still room was where preserves, cordials, medicines, and fancy drinks were made. The still room maid would make jams, jellies, pickles, candied fruits, and distill flower waters and medicinal tinctures. This actually required some skill and knowledge, so it was considered a step up from regular kitchen work. Preserving food was essential because, no refrigerators. If you had fresh fruit in the summer, you'd better turn it into jam or dry it, because otherwise it would rot. Meat was salted or smoked. Vegetables were pickled. Everything was about making food last as long as possible. Let's drift over to the dining room for a moment, because serving meals was its own elaborate dance. When it was time to eat, the footman would set the table with linens, china, silver, glassware, all of which had to be perfectly clean and arranged just so. The butler oversaw this, making sure everything was correct. The butler was in charge of the wine cellar, the family's valuable silverware, and the general serving of meals. He was usually the highest-ranking male servant and acted like he was managing a military operation. The footman would then carry out all the dishes from the kitchen, arrange them on the table in a specific layout, and stand around waiting to serve. When someone needed their wine refilled or wanted a particular dish passed to them, the footman jumped into action. They were supposed to be invisible, but always available, which sounds exhausting. After the meal, everything had to be cleared, taken back to the kitchen, and washed. The leftovers went to the servants, though by leftovers I mean the servants got to eat whatever the family didn't finish, which was often quite a lot. Wealthy people often didn't finish most of what was served because the point was the display, not actually eating everything. Now, running a household wasn't just about keeping things clean and people fed. There was also the matter of maintaining the actual house and grounds. If you had an estate, you had gardeners, groundskeepers, stable hands, coachmen. The gardens had to be maintained, paths swept, hedges trimmed, flowers planted. The stables had to be cleaned, horses fed and groomed, carriages washed and repaired. The head gardener was often a respected position because elaborate gardens were a status symbol. You wanted perfect lawns, manicured hedges, exotic plants, maybe a fountain or some statuary. This all required constant work. Grass had to be cut with scythes, yes, by hand. Weeds had to be pulled, plants watered. It was endless. Inside the house, you also had maintenance. Candles had to be replaced constantly. Lamp oil had to be refilled. Fires had to be tended. Furniture had to be polished. Carpets beaten to get the dust out. Curtains cleaned. Silver polished, because silver tarnishes if you look at it wrong. The amount of polishing that went on in an 18th century household was truly absurd. Silver, brass, copper, wood, everything had to gleam. There were special polishes for each type of metal, and the servants would spend hours rubbing things until they shined, because heaven forbid a guest see a tarnished candlestick. Let's talk about the lady of the house for a minute, because theoretically she was in charge of all this. In reality, if you were a wealthy woman in the 18th century, you probably delegated most of the actual management to your housekeeper and steward, but you were still expected to oversee things, at least superficially. You'd meet with the housekeeper every morning to discuss the day's plans, approve menus, go over household accounts, and address any issues. Some women took this very seriously and were genuinely involved in running their households efficiently. Others just nodded along and went back to their embroidery or letter writing or whatever else filled the time. But even the hands-off ladies had to deal with social obligations, which were basically a full-time job themselves. You had to manage your calling cards, plan dinner parties, organize balls if you were fancy enough, make sure your children were being properly educated, oversee their wardrobes, handle correspondence. Being a lady of leisure wasn't actually that leisurely. And if you were a middle-class woman, not wealthy enough for a full staff, but comfortable enough to have maybe a maid or two, you were doing a lot of this work yourself. You'd be planning meals, doing some of the cooking, definitely doing the sewing and mending, teaching your children, managing your small household budget. It was a lot. For the lower classes, running a household meant doing absolutely everything yourself, usually while also working outside the home or running a shop or farm. You'd be cooking, cleaning, doing laundry, making clothes, raising children, tending a garden, maybe keeping chickens or a pig. There was no time for rest. You worked from sunrise to well past sunset, every day, forever. One thing that's wild to think about is how much time was spent on tasks we now do in minutes. Making bread from scratch, which meant grinding or buying flour, mixing dough, letting it rise, baking it, took hours. We pop bread in a toaster. They spent half a day on it. Mending and making clothes was another huge time sink. Everything was made by hand. If your shirt ripped, you couldn't just buy a new one for $10 at a store. You had to sit down with a needle and thread and fix it. If you needed a new dress, you either paid a seamstress a lot of money or you made it yourself, which could take weeks. Wealthy families had ladies' maids whose whole job was to take care of the women's clothing and help them dress. Because getting dressed in the 18th century was a multi-person operation if you were wearing the full fancy get-up. Corsets, petticoats, stomachers, gowns with a million tiny buttons or laces, shoes, stockings, jewelry, hair pieces, powder. You couldn't do it alone. The lady's maid would help you into all of this, dress your hair, and then help you out of it all at night. Men had valets for the same reason. Wigs needed to be styled and powdered. Elaborate coats and waistcoats had to be put on properly. Cravats tied just right. Shoes buckled. It was all very involved. So, when we talk about running a household in the 18th century, we're really talking about managing a complex operation that required dozens of people, careful planning, constant labor, and a shocking amount of money. The costs were significant. You had to pay all those servants, though not very much, to be fair. Servants' wages were pretty low, but you had to feed them, house them, provide their livery. You had to buy all the household supplies, soap, candles, lamp oil, coal for the fires, food, linens, cleaning supplies. You had to maintain the building, repair things when they broke, replace items when they wore out. Account books from 18th century households showed just how much was spent on daily upkeep. Hundreds of pounds a year just keeping the house running, and that's not even counting things like clothing for the family, social entertainment, or big purchases. And if something went wrong, a fire, a flood, a theft, it could be financially devastating. Insurance existed, but wasn't universal, and many families just had to absorb the loss. The whole system was built on a rigid class hierarchy. The servants knew their place, the family knew theirs, and everyone played their role. Servants were expected to be deferential, obedient, and invisible when not needed. In return, they got steady employment, room and board, and maybe a small wage. But it wasn't a comfortable life for the staff. Servants worked long hours, like 14 to 16 hours a day wasn't unusual. They got maybe one half-day off per week if they were lucky. They lived in the attic or basement in small, often cramped rooms. They ate the leftovers. They had almost no privacy and little personal freedom. And yet, for many people, going into service was one of the better options available. It was more stable than farm work, safer than factory work, and at least you were guaranteed food and shelter. Country girls would come to the city hoping to get a position in a good household because that was seen as a respectable way to make a living. There was a whole etiquette to being in service. You didn't speak unless spoken to. You didn't make eye contact with your employers. You used the servants' stairs, not the main staircase. You referred to the family with the proper titles. You kept their secrets. You stayed out of sight as much as possible. It's kind of eerie when you think about it. All these people living in the same house, but occupying completely different worlds. The family upstairs in their elegant rooms, living their lives of relative comfort. The servants downstairs or in the back hallways, making all of that comfort possible, but never really being acknowledged as full people. Anyway, that's the basic framework of what it meant to run a household in the 18th century. A lot of people, a lot of work, and almost no spoken rules, and an absolutely staggering amount of effort just to maintain what we'd consider basic living standards. We're just getting started, though. There's so much more to unpack about the weird details, the specific tasks, the drama that happened below stairs. So, settle in, get cozy, and let's keep floating through the daily grind of the 1700s. So, where were we? Right. The absolutely mind-numbing amount of work it took just to keep an 18th century household from descending into chaos. Let's dig deeper into the weirdness, because honestly, the more you learn about daily life back then, the more exhausting it sounds. We touched on the basic servant hierarchy, but let's really get into the specifics, because every role had its own little world of responsibilities and absurdities. Take the chambermaid, for example. Her job was to take care of the bedrooms. Sounds simple enough, right? Wrong. This meant making beds every single day, with sheets that weighed approximately 1,000 pounds when you factor in all the layers. You had the mattress, often stuffed with horsehair or feathers, which needed to be turned and fluffed regularly to prevent lumps, then sheets, blankets, coverlets, and, if the family was fancy, a decorative bedspread that probably weighed more than the maid herself. But wait, there's more. Chamber pots. Yes, we have to talk about chamber pots, because this was the 18th century, and most houses didn't have indoor plumbing. People did their business in decorative porcelain pots that were kept in the bedroom, usually inside a little cabinet called a commode. Very discreet, very classy. And guess who had to empty those every morning? The chambermaid. She'd go room to room, collect all the chamber pots, carry them down the back stairs, trying very hard not to spill anything, empty them into the cesspit or wherever the household waste went, rinse them out, and bring them back. Every single day. Some households had close stools, which were basically fancy chairs with a hole in the seat and a pot underneath. Same concept, same unfortunate job for the chambermaid. The really wealthy families might have a private servant called a groom of the stool, whose literal job was to assist with royal bathroom needs. But that was more of a Tudor thing. By the 18th century, we'd mostly moved on from that particular honor. Thank goodness. The chambermaid also had to dust everything in the bedrooms, sweep the floors, change the bed linens regularly, which meant stripping the bed, hauling the dirty linens to the laundry, getting fresh ones from the housekeeper's linen closet, and remaking the bed with hospital corners that would make a drill sergeant weep with joy. Oh, and she had to tend the bedroom fires in the winter, carry up coal or wood, lay the fire, light it, make sure it didn't go out, clean out the ashes. In a big house with 10 or 12 bedrooms, This was basically an all-day marathon of running up and down stairs with heavy buckets. Speaking of stairs, let's appreciate for a moment how much vertical travel was involved in running an 18th century household. Most grand houses were at least 3 or 4 stories. The family lived on the main floors, servants lived in the attic, kitchens were often in the basement or a separate wing. So servants were constantly going up and down stairs carrying stuff. Breakfast tray to the ladies' bedroom on the second floor, up 2 flights. Dirty dishes back to the kitchen, down 2 flights. Fresh linens from the storage closet on the 3rd floor to the guest bedroom on the 2nd floor. You get the idea. The average servant probably climbed the equivalent of a small mountain every single day. And they did all this in long skirts and aprons if they were women, or in full livery if they were men. No comfortable athletic wear, no sneakers. Women wore stays, a less intense version of a corset that kept you upright but didn't exactly facilitate easy breathing during physical labor. Men wore knee breeches, stockings, and buckled shoes. Everyone was just slightly uncomfortable all the time. Let's talk about the nursery staff for a minute, because if the family had children, that was a whole separate department. At the top, you had the governess. She was usually an educated gentlewoman who'd fallen on hard times. Maybe her father died and left her with no money, or she never married and needed to support herself. Being a governess was one of the few respectable jobs available to educated women, but it was also kind of a miserable existence. The governess lived in this weird liminal space, where she wasn't quite a servant, but definitely wasn't part of the family. She ate alone, usually in the schoolroom or her own room. She couldn't socialize with the other servants because that would be beneath her station, but the family didn't want her hanging around their social events either. So she was just isolated, teaching the children, maintaining discipline, and being generally lonely. She taught the girls reading, writing, arithmetic, maybe some French, music, drawing, and needlework. The boys would be taught by her until they were old enough for a tutor or to be sent off to school. She was expected to mold them into proper young ladies and gentlemen, which was a tall order when you're dealing with spoiled rich kids who knew you couldn't actually do anything if they misbehaved. Then you had the nursemaid or nanny who took care of the younger children. She was responsible for keeping them clean, fed, dressed, and alive. She'd sleep in the nursery to be available at night. She'd change nappies, which were cloth that had to be washed, obviously. She'd soothe crying babies, supervise toddlers, make sure nobody put anything poisonous in their mouth. If the family was really wealthy, they might also have a wet nurse, a woman hired to breastfeed the baby because upper-class ladies often didn't breastfeed their own children. This was partly a status thing, and partly because it was believed breastfeeding prevented pregnancy. So if you wanted to have lots of heirs quickly, you hired someone else to do it. The whole practice was kind of grim when you think about it. The wet nurse had just had her own baby, which meant she was either nursing 2 infants, or more often, her own baby was sent away or weaned early so she could focus on the wealthy family's child. The class dynamics of literally paying a poor woman to give her milk to your baby instead of her own, yeah, not great. Nursery staff also had to deal with the absolutely bonkers medical practices of the time. If a child got sick, the family would call a doctor, who would probably prescribe something useless or actively harmful. Bloodletting for fevers, mercury for pretty much everything, laudanum, which was opium dissolved in alcohol, for teething pain or to make babies sleep. Just casually drugging infants, no big deal. The nursemaid was expected to carry out these treatments, even if they seemed insane. which they often were. Childhood mortality was high, and you have to wonder how much of it was preventable if they'd just not done some of that stuff. Let's float over to the male servants for a bit, because we haven't talked enough about their specific roles. The valet, or gentleman's gentleman, was the male equivalent of a lady's maid. He took care of his employer's clothing, helped him dress, shaved him, yes, shaved him, with a straight razor every morning. One slip and you've just cut your boss's throat, so no pressure there. The valet also maintained the gentleman's wardrobe, which meant brushing coats, cleaning boots, mending tears, making sure everything was pressed and ready. He'd lay out clothes for the day, put away the clothes from the night before, and generally act as a personal assistant. Valets were usually pretty well treated because they were in constant close contact with their employers. A good valet knew his master's secrets, habits, preferences, and vices. He'd know if his master was having an affair, if he was in debt, if he had embarrassing medical problems. Discretion was essential, and gentlemen often developed a weird sort of bond with their valets. Not friendship exactly, but a familiar dependency. The butler, as we mentioned, was the king of the male servants. He managed the wine cellar, which was a serious responsibility because wine was expensive and had to be stored properly. He'd decant wine, serve it at the proper temperature, and keep careful inventory so nobody was sneaking bottles. He also managed the household silver and valuable items. The silver was locked up when not in use, and the butler had the key. He'd supervise the footmen in cleaning and polishing it. He'd also sometimes handle the household accounts, pay tradesmen, and generally act as the master's right-hand man in household management. Butlers were usually older men who'd worked their way up from footmen. You started pretty, and if you were smart and reliable, you eventually became butler. By that point, you'd lost the pretty but gained authority, which was probably a fair trade. The footmen, as we said, were the decorative ones, but they also did actual work. They'd answer the door, announce visitors, carry messages, serve meals, accompany the family on outings. If the lady of the house went shopping, footmen would come along to carry packages and look impressive. They'd also ride on the back of the carriage when the family went out. There were special footman stands on the back of fancy carriages, and the footmen would stand there, holding on, while the carriage bounced along on terrible 18th century roads in bad weather in their fancy livery. It looked very grand, but was probably terrifying and deeply uncomfortable. Coachmen drove the carriages and were responsible for the horses. They had to know how to handle a team of horses in city traffic, which in the 18th century meant pedestrians, other carriages, livestock being driven to market, street vendors, and general chaos. They also had to maintain the carriage, keep it clean, and make sure it was in good repair. Grooms and stable boys took care of the horses, which was a whole job in itself. Horses had to be fed, watered, groomed, exercised, and have their stables mucked out. Mucking out stables is exactly what it sounds like. Shoveling out all the manure and dirty hay, then putting down fresh hay. This happened daily, and it smelled exactly how you'd imagine. Horses also needed their hooves picked and checked regularly, their tack cleaned and maintained, and occasional veterinary care. A good horse was valuable, so you couldn't just neglect them. The head groom was often a trusted servant because horses were such an important part of 18th century life. Now, let's talk about the schedules, because the routine of an 18th century household was rigid and relentless. Servants woke up early, like 5 in the morning early. sometimes earlier in winter because it took longer to get the fires going. The housemaids would be up first to light fires and start cleaning before the family woke up. The kitchen staff would be up just as early to start preparing breakfast. Even though the family might not eat until 8 or 9, bread had to be baked, porridge made, tea prepared, meat cooked if they wanted a hearty breakfast. Everything took time. The lady's maid and valet would wake their employers at the designated time, help them with morning routines, and get them dressed for the day. Breakfast for servants was usually quick and basic: bread, maybe some cheese, tea or ale. They'd eat in the servants' hall, which was their common room in the basement or back of the house. There was a hierarchy even in seating. The butler and housekeeper sat at the head of the table, and everyone else sat according to their rank.
After breakfast, the real work began. Maids would clean the main rooms. The chambermaid would do the bedrooms. Footmen would polish silver, clean boots, run errands. The kitchen would start preparing dinner. Remember, dinner was the main meal and was served in the early afternoon, usually between 2 and 4 o'clock. The morning was also when the lady of the house would meet with her housekeeper to go over plans, and the master might meet with his steward to discuss estate business. Dinner preparation was an all-day affair. Multiple courses meant multiple dishes, all being cooked simultaneously with primitive equipment. The kitchen would be hot, chaotic, and stressful. The head cook would be orchestrating everything, probably yelling at the scullery maid and tasting sauces and making sure nothing burned. When dinner was ready, it would be carried up to the dining room by footmen. The butler would supervise the service. The family would eat, while the servants stood around waiting to refill glasses and pass dishes. This could take hours if it was a formal dinner with guests. After dinner, the family might rest or socialize. The servants would eat their dinner, the leftovers from upstairs, and then clean up all the dishes in the kitchen. Later in the evening, tea would be served. This meant more prep, more service, more dishes. Then supper, which was a lighter evening meal. More prep, more service, more cleanup. The lady's maid and valet would help their employers get ready for bed, which was another whole process of undressing, night clothes, hair care. Finally, the servants themselves could go to bed, probably around 10 or 11 at night, only to wake up at 5 and do it all again.
One day off a week, maybe. Except not really, because essential tasks still had to be done. Animals still needed to be fed. Fires still needed to be tended. The family still needed to eat. On Sundays, servants were theoretically supposed to be able to attend church, but someone still had to prepare meals and keep the house running, so it was staggered. Some servants would go to an early service, others to a later one. The idea of a vacation or holiday, as we understand it, didn't really exist for servants. You might get a few days off at Christmas if you were lucky. Otherwise, you worked all the time, years, decades even, if you stayed with the same family. Let's talk about special occasions, because those made everything even more complicated. If the family was hosting a dinner party, the whole household went into overdrive. The house had to be cleaned to perfection, extra dishes prepared, the good china and silver brought out, flowers arranged, guest rooms prepared if people were staying over. The footmen would be polished up and put on display. The cook would be creating elaborate dishes she maybe only made a few times a year. Everyone had to be on their best behavior because the family's reputation was at stake. If the dinner party went well, the family looked good. If anything went wrong, a course served cold, a guest's wine glass left empty for more than 30 seconds, a footman who tripped, it was a scandal.
Balls were even worse. If you were hosting a ball, you needed musicians, extra lighting, food for dozens of people, drinks flowing all night, the ballroom prepared, a cloakroom for guests' belongings, servants to announce arrivals. It was a massive undertaking. The staff would work for days beforehand getting ready, then work all night during the ball itself, then work the next day cleaning up. And they had to be invisible during the event, just silently making everything happen while the gentry danced and drank and socialized. Weddings, christenings, funerals, all of these required extra work and careful planning. Funerals especially had elaborate protocols. The house would be draped in black cloth. Servants would wear mourning livery. There would be a funeral feast to prepare, and the servants were expected to look appropriately somber while also making sure everything ran smoothly. Now, let's acknowledge the below-stairs drama, because when you cram a bunch of people into close quarters and make them work 14-hour days together, things get messy. Romances happened, obviously. Servants would develop crushes, have secret relationships, sometimes even run off together. The housekeeper and butler tried to prevent this because it was seen as improper and could lead to pregnancy, which was a disaster for a female servant. If you got pregnant out of wedlock, you were fired. No references, good luck surviving. There were definitely affairs between servants and employers, too, though this was officially forbidden and scandalous. But it happened, a lot. Usually it ended badly for the servant. The gentleman would seduce a housemaid, she'd get pregnant, and then she'd be fired, and he'd face zero consequences. The system was not designed to be fair. Servants also fought with each other. Petty jealousies, conflicts over workload, personality clashes. The housekeeper and butler had to manage all this drama while also doing their own jobs. Theft was another issue. Some servants would steal small items, food, candles, cloth, usually things they thought wouldn't be missed. Sometimes they'd steal more valuable items. If caught, they'd be fired and possibly prosecuted. Theft by a servant was taken very seriously. But there was also a culture of perks. Servants knew they were allowed certain things: used candle stubs, leftover food, worn-out linens that could be repurposed. These weren't technically stealing, they were understood benefits of the job. But the line between perks and theft could be fuzzy. Some servants drank too much. Alcoholism was a real problem, especially among male servants who had access to the wine cellar. Butlers were supposed to manage the wine, but that also meant they could help themselves. Some did. There were also servants who were just bad at their jobs, lazy, incompetent, or difficult. But firing someone meant finding and training a replacement, which was a hassle. So sometimes employers would put up with mediocre servants for years rather than deal with the turnover. On the flip side, loyal, competent servants could stay with a family for 40 or 50 years. There are records of servants who worked for the same family for 40 or 50 years, eventually retiring with a small pension if they were lucky.
Some were even remembered in the family's will with a small bequest. The relationship between long-time servants and their employers could get genuinely affectionate in a paternalistic sort of way. The family would know the servants' life stories, help them in times of trouble, attend their weddings or funerals. It wasn't equality, but it wasn't always completely cold and transactional either. Still, at the end of the day, servants were employees. They could be fired at any time for almost any reason. They had very few rights. Their lives were entirely dependent on their employer's goodwill. Let's talk about the supplies and logistics, because keeping a household stocked was a whole project. Food had to be bought regularly. For big households, this meant buying in bulk. A steward would negotiate with tradesmen for deliveries of meat, produce, dairy, bread, and whatever else was needed. Bills would be settled monthly or quarterly. Meat came from the butcher, bread from the baker, unless you made your own, vegetables and fruits from the greengrocer or your own garden if you had one, milk and butter from the dairy, fish from the fishmonger, tea, coffee, sugar, and spices from specialty shops, often expensive. Everything had to be inspected when it arrived to make sure you weren't being cheated with subpar goods. The cook or housekeeper would check the quality. If something wasn't acceptable, it would be sent back. Storage was important because you couldn't just run to the store whenever you wanted more of something. Dry goods were kept in the pantry, root vegetables in the cellar, meat in the larder, which was a cool room designed to keep things as fresh as possible before they spoiled. Preserving and pickling, as we mentioned, was essential. In the summer and fall, when produce was abundant, the still room maid and kitchen staff would be preserving like mad. Jams, jellies, pickled vegetables, dried fruits, salted meats. All of this to get through the winter when fresh food was scarce. Candles and lamp oil had to be stocked. Households went through absurd amounts of candles. Every room needed lighting, and candles burned down fast. Tallow candles were cheaper but smelled bad and smoked. Beeswax candles were nicer but expensive. Most households used both, depending on the room and occasion. Soap was bought or made. Some households made their own soap from lye and fat, which was a smelly, unpleasant process. Others bought it from a soap maker. Fabric and sewing supplies were needed for making and mending linens, clothes, curtains, thread, needles, pins, buttons, ribbons. The housekeeper kept all this locked up because it was valuable. Coal for the fires had to be delivered regularly, especially in winter. It was stored in a coal cellar and hauled up as needed. Wood, too, if the household used wood-burning fires. All of this had a cost, and someone had to keep track of it all. The steward or housekeeper would maintain account books, noting every purchase and expense. These books were sometimes reviewed by the master or mistress to make sure money wasn't being wasted or embezzled. Running a household was, essentially, running a small business. Budget, inventory, staff management, quality control. It required real organizational skills and constant attention. And if you were a middle-class family trying to keep up appearances without much money, it was even more stressful. You'd scrimp and save, buy cheaper cuts of meat, make do with fewer servants, patch and mend everything until it fell apart, all while trying to look like you were doing just fine, thank you. The pressure to maintain social status was intense. You couldn't just admit you were struggling financially. That would be humiliating. So you'd continue hosting dinners you couldn't afford, dressing in clothes that were secretly falling apart, and pretending everything was fine while quietly drowning in debt. Some families went bankrupt trying to keep up. Others married off their children strategically to bring in money. The whole system was built on appearances and social performance, which made everything even more exhausting. Anyway, that's a deeper dive into the daily grind, the endless tasks, the complicated logistics, the human drama, the sheer relentlessness of keeping an 18th century household functioning. It's honestly amazing anyone had time to do anything besides just survive the day. But we're not done yet. There's still so much more to talk about. The regional differences, the seasonal changes, the specific weird little tasks that don't fit into neat categories. So stay cozy, keep those eyes heavy, and let's keep wandering through this exhausting historical landscape. All right, let's keep drifting through the maze of 18th century domestic life. We've covered the basics, we've gone deeper into the daily grind, and now we're going to meander into the stuff that doesn't always make it into the history books. The seasonal shifts, the regional quirks, the bizarre little tasks that somehow took up entire afternoons. Get comfortable. Maybe adjust that pillow one more time. We're settling in for the long haul. One thing we haven't really touched on is how different everything was depending on where you lived. Running a household in London was a completely different beast than running one in rural Yorkshire or over in the American colonies or in Scotland. Let's start with the city versus country divide because it was significant. In cities or other major cities, you had access to everything. Markets were everywhere, tradesmen delivered to your door, you could buy exotic imports, coffee, tea, chocolate, spices from halfway around the world. If you needed something, there was probably a shop for it within walking distance or a short carriage ride away. But cities were also expensive. Rent was higher, food cost more, servants expected better wages because they had options. The cost of living in London was astronomical compared to the countryside. Families who had a country estate would often spend only part of the year in their London townhouse, usually during the season, which was the social season when Parliament was in session and everyone who was anyone was in town for balls and parties and general socializing. When the family moved between houses, the servants had to pack everything up, transport it, unpack, and set up the other house. This was a massive undertaking. You couldn't just throw some clothes in a suitcase. We're talking trunks of clothing, linens, silverware, personal items, sometimes even furniture. The family would travel in their comfortable carriage, while servants either rode in a second carriage or even walked alongside with the luggage carts. Once everyone arrived at the destination house, the servants would have to air everything out. Houses that had been closed up for months got musty and damp. Clean everything. Make sure there weren't mice or other unwanted residents. Get the fires going. Stock the kitchen. It could take days to get a house ready for occupancy. In the countryside, life moved slower, but was more self-sufficient. Country estates often produced their own food. They'd have gardens, orchards, dairy cows, chickens, pigs, maybe sheep. The estate would have farms that tenant farmers worked, providing rent in the form of money or goods. The household would make its own butter and cheese, cure its own meat, brew its own beer, because beer was safer to drink than water in many cases. The still room would be busy with preserves and cordials. There might be a brew house, a bakehouse, a dairy, a smokehouse, all these separate buildings dedicated to specific tasks. Country households needed different kinds of servants, more outdoor workers, gardeners, farm laborers, gamekeepers if the estate had hunting grounds. The gamekeeper's job was to manage the game animals, prevent poaching, and organize hunts. Poaching was a serious crime because game animals were considered the property of the landowner, and there were harsh penalties for anyone caught illegally hunting. But country life was also isolated. If you needed something that wasn't produced locally, you had to wait for market day or send someone on a long trip to the nearest town. Entertainment was limited. Social calls meant traveling for hours to visit the nearest neighbor of your class. Servants in the country often came from local families. Everyone knew everyone. There was less anonymity, which meant less freedom in some ways, but also more community. Country servants might have family nearby, might attend the local church with people they'd known their whole lives.
City servants were more likely to be far from home, especially the ones who'd come from the countryside looking for work. They'd be lonely, isolated in a big city, vulnerable to exploitation, but they also had more opportunities to move between households, to climb the household hierarchy by switching to better positions. Now let's talk about the seasons, because the rhythm of the year dictated so much of household work. Spring meant spring cleaning, which was exactly as exhausting as it sounds. After a winter of fires burning constantly, everything was covered in a layer of soot and grime. Once the weather warmed up enough that you didn't need fires in every room, the house got torn apart and deep cleaned. Carpets were taken up, hauled outside, beaten until all the dust came out, then laid back down. Curtains were taken down, washed and rehung. Every piece of furniture was moved and the floors scrubbed underneath. Walls were wiped down, windows washed inside and out, chimneys swept. Chimney sweeping was done by chimney sweeps, obviously, but it was often done by small children because they could fit up the narrow chimneys. They'd climb up inside, scraping off the soot and creosote buildup. It was dangerous, filthy work. Kids got stuck, got burned by still hot chimneys, developed respiratory problems from breathing soot. But it was cheap labor, and nobody seemed overly concerned about the ethics. Spring was also when the gardens started demanding attention. Seeds planted, beds prepared, everything coming back to life after winter. The household would start getting fresh vegetables again, which must have been a relief after months of root vegetables and preserved foods.
Summer was busy with growing and harvesting. The kitchen would be processing fresh produce. Fruits had to be made into jams and preserves, vegetables pickled or stored, herbs dried for winter use. Summer was also social season in the country, because that's when the families who'd been in London for the spring season would return to their estates. House parties, visits from friends and relatives, outdoor entertainments. More work for the servants, of course. The heat made some tasks easier, for instance, laundry dried faster, but made others miserable. Working in a kitchen with a fire going all day in the summer heat was absolutely brutal. The scullery maid scrubbing pots in steamy water, the cook standing over a roasting fire. It must have been unbearable. Fall meant harvest, which was a huge event on country estates. Everyone would be involved in bringing in the crops. Even household servants might be pulled in to help. There would be a harvest feast, which meant the kitchen staff preparing food for potentially dozens of farm workers and servants. Fall was also when animals were slaughtered for winter meat.
You didn't want to feed animals through the winter if you didn't have to, so most livestock, except breeding stock, would be slaughtered in the fall. The meat would be salted, smoked, or otherwise preserved. This was a big job: butchering, processing, preserving. The household would be securing its food supply for the winter. Winter meant being stuck indoors more, fires in every room, going through stored food, shorter days meaning more candles and lamp oil being used. The servants would have the endless task of keeping fires going, which meant hauling fuel, tending fires, cleaning out ashes. Winter was also when the social season happened in London, so wealthy families would pack up and move to town, as we mentioned. The country house would be left with a skeleton staff to maintain it while the family was away. Christmas was the one time servants might get a bit of a break. There were traditional gifts from the employer, maybe a small amount of money, some extra food, hand-me-down clothing. Some families gave their servants a few days off to visit family. Others hosted a servants' ball or dinner, which was a nice gesture, but also meant the upper servants had to organize it, so, more work. Let's talk about water for a minute, because water management was a huge part of household logistics. If you were in a city, you might have access to piped water from a water company. London got its first water companies in the 17th century, and by the 18th century, some areas had water piped to houses, but it wasn't reliable, wasn't clean, and certainly wasn't running water in every room like we have now. More commonly, water had to be fetched, either from a well, a pump, or carried from the nearest water source. This was heavy work. Water is heavy. A bucket of water weighs a lot, and if you need enough water for drinking, cooking, washing, and cleaning for an entire household, you're hauling a lot of buckets. Usually, the lowest-ranking servants did the water hauling. Scullery maids, junior footmen, odd-job boys. They'd fill buckets from the pump or well and carry them to wherever water was needed. Want to wash your hands? Someone had to bring up water and pour it into your wash basin. Want a bath? Multiple people had to haul multiple buckets of water upstairs, fill a tub, and then carry it all back down afterward.
Speaking of baths, let's address the whole bathing situation, because it was not like today. People in the 18th century bathed way less frequently than we do. This wasn't because they loved being dirty. It was because bathing was an enormous hassle. You needed a tub, which had to be set up in a room, usually in front of a fire. You needed gallons of hot water, which meant heating it on the kitchen fire and hauling it upstairs. Then, after the bath, you had to bail out the water and haul it back downstairs. For all that effort, most people just didn't bother most of the time. They'd wash face and hands daily, change their undergarments regularly, maybe take a full bath a few times a year. The wealthy bathed more often because they had servants to do all the hauling, but even then, a bath was an event. The hip bath was a common style, a tub shaped so you sat with your knees up. It didn't hold as much water as a full tub, which was a plus because less hauling. Some people used public bathhouses, which existed in cities, but they were often seen as disreputable places where immoral activities happened, so respectable people mostly avoided them. The wealthy might have bathrooms, dedicated rooms for bathing, but they still had to have water brought in. The idea of turning on a tap and getting instant hot water was pure fantasy. Servants probably bathed even less frequently than their employers because they had less time and no one to haul water for them. They'd wash in cold water when they could, change their underclothes when they had clean ones available, and just generally deal with being slightly grimy most of the time.
This brings us back to laundry again, because we haven't fully appreciated how central laundry was to household management. Personal linen, shirts, shifts, stockings, undergarments,
was what people changed regularly. The idea was that your underlayers absorbed sweat and dirt, protecting your outer clothes. So you'd wear the same gown or coat for ages, but change your underlinen more often. This meant a lot of laundry. A wealthy family might change underlinen daily, which meant washing multiple sets per person per week. The laundry maids were in a constant cycle of washing, drying, and ironing. Laundry was usually done in a dedicated wash house or laundry room. Big households had a laundress or multiple laundry maids whose only job was laundry. We talked about the process, but let's really sit with how labor-intensive it was. The sorting, soaking, boiling, scrubbing, rinsing multiple times, winging out, drying, ironing. Each step took hours, and you had to be careful because different fabrics needed different treatment. Delicate laces and fine linens couldn't be boiled as long as tough sheets. Colored fabrics might fade if you weren't careful. Ironing was its own special trial. The iron hobs were heavy, several pounds each. You'd have 2 or 3 heating on the stove while you used one. Iron until that one cooled down, swap it for a hot one, continue. Your arms would be aching, you'd be hot from standing near the stove, and if you scorched something, you'd have to answer to the housekeeper. Starching was another task. Collars, cuffs, caps, anything that needed to look crisp had to be starched. You'd make starch from wheat flour or rice flour mixed with water, dip the item in it, let it dry slightly, then iron it stiff. Get the consistency wrong, and it would either be too floppy or crackling hard. Some households sent laundry out to professional laundresses, but that cost money and you risked your items getting lost or damaged. Most households with sufficient staff did laundry in-house. Now let's talk about sewing and textile work, because this was another massive time sink. Every household needed someone who could sew. Clothes had to be made, mended, altered, linens had to be hemmed, sheets repaired, curtains adjusted. There was endless needlework. The lady of the house usually did decorative needlework, embroidery, lacework, stuff that showed skill and refinement. But she wasn't darning stockings or mending torn sheets. That was for servants. There was often a dedicated sewing maid, or the housemaids would do mending as part of their duties. Darning stockings was a constant task. Stockings were knitted and wore out quickly, especially at the heel and toe. You darn them over and over until they were more darning than original stocking. Sheets were expensive, so when they wore thin in the middle, you didn't throw them out. You'd cut them down the middle, flip the outer edges to the center, and sew them back together so the worn part was now at the edges. This was called sides to middle and could extend the life of a sheet by years. Clothing was altered and remade constantly. A gown might be taken apart, the fabric reused for a new style, trimmed differently, dyed a new color. Nothing was wasted because fabric was expensive. Servants' clothing was usually provided by the household or made from fabric given to them. A maid might get a couple of work dresses per year, made from sturdy, cheap fabric. Aprons, caps, kerchiefs. Footmen got their livery from the household, often tailored to fit. If you were a servant and wanted nicer clothes for your day off, you had to make them yourself, or save up to buy them. Or you'd get hand-me-downs from your employers, which was common. A lady's maid might inherit her mistress's old dresses, alter them to fit, and end up better dressed than her station would normally allow.
Let's drift over to the topic of illness and health care in the household, because people got sick, and dealing with that was another layer of household management. When someone in the family got sick, it was a crisis. A doctor would be called, if you could afford one. Doctors were expensive, and their treatments were often useless or harmful, but they were what you had. The sick person would be confined to bed. A servant, often a chambermaid or the lady's maid, would be assigned to nurse them. This meant bringing meals, changing sheets, administering whatever treatments the doctor prescribed, emptying chamber pots, keeping the fire going, basically being on call day and night.
If the illness was serious, the household would go into a sort of hushed mode. Quiet, no entertaining, extra care to keep things clean to prevent the illness from spreading, though they didn't understand germ theory yet. Contagious diseases were terrifying because they could rip through a household. Smallpox, typhus, scarlet fever, tuberculosis. Servants were especially vulnerable because they lived in close quarters and often had poor nutrition and were already exhausted from overwork. If a servant got sick, the response varied. A valued servant might be cared for in the household, allowed to rest, given light duties until recovered. Others might be sent away, especially if the illness was contagious. If you were too sick to work and couldn't afford a doctor, you just hoped you got better, or you didn't, and that was that. Childbirth happened at home, attended by a midwife. This was dangerous for both mother and baby. If complications arose, there wasn't much that could be done. Many women died in childbirth. Many babies didn't survive. If a servant got pregnant, which, as we mentioned, was a disaster, she'd be fired before she started showing, if possible. If not, she'd work as long as she could. Then, well, there were few good options. Workhouses, charity hospitals, back alley solutions that we won't detail here. It was grim. The still-room still-maid often served as the pharmacy. The still-room maid would make remedies from herbs and traditional recipes. Lavender water for headaches, rose hip syrup for colds, chamomile tea for stomach upset. These remedies were probably more effective than what the doctor prescribed, honestly, if only because they were less likely to poison you.
Wealthy families might have a receipt book, a recipe book that included both food recipes and medical remedies. These would be passed down through generations with new recipes added. Grandmother's remedy for a cough sitting right next to how to make a good pudding. Dental care was basically non-existent. Teeth rotted. If a tooth hurt badly enough, you'd have it pulled, probably by a barber surgeon or a traveling tooth puller at a fair. No anesthesia, just someone yanking your tooth out with pliers while you tried not to scream. Afterward, you just had a gap in your teeth. Dentures existed but were expensive and often made from uncomfortable materials like ivory or even teeth pulled from corpses. Delightful. So people often had terrible teeth by middle age, even the wealthy, though they at least had access to tooth powders and probably weren't eating as much sugar as we do. The poor often had horrific dental problems with no recourse except suffering until the tooth either fell out or got pulled. Let's talk about market day, because this was a big event in country towns. Once a week, or in some places twice a week, the town would have a market. Farmers and traders would bring goods to sell: produce, livestock, cloth, tools, household items.
It was where people bought what they needed and also socialized. The cook or a trusted servant would go to market to buy fresh food. This was a skill. You had to know how to judge quality, how to haggle, how to get the best deals. Tradesmen knew the servants from big households and would sometimes try to charge them more, knowing the household had money. A smart servant could negotiate prices down.
Markets were also where news spread. Who had died, who was getting married, whose crops failed, what the government was up to. In an era before mass media, the market was your news source. Fairs were bigger events, happening a few times a year. They'd have entertainers, special goods, hiring fairs where servants looking for positions could meet potential employers. Young people might go to the fair hoping to find work or just to have some fun on their rare free time. Peddlers also traveled between towns, bringing goods directly to houses. The peddler would have a pack or a cart full of small items, ribbons, thread, buttons, small tools, pamphlets, cheap jewelry. The servants would gather to see what he had, maybe buy something with their tiny wages. The lady of the house might buy ribbons or lace. In cities, there were more permanent shops: haberdashers, mercers, grocers, tea dealers. Shopping was more convenient, but also more expensive. The wealthy would send servants to shop, giving them a list and money. Or the lady herself might go, with a servant or two accompanying her to carry purchases. Shopping trips were one of the few excursions a lady might take regularly. It was considered acceptable to visit shops, though she'd be chaperoned. She might spend hours looking at fabrics, trying on gloves, selecting trims for a new gown. The shopkeeper would fawn over her because she had money to spend. Let's meander over to the subject of education and training for servants, because they weren't born knowing how to do all these specialized tasks.
Young servants usually started in their teens, sometimes even younger. A girl might become a scullery maid at 12 or 13. A boy might start as a stable boy or hall boy around the same age. They'd learn on the job from older servants. The scullery maid learned from the cook and the other kitchen staff. The junior footman learned from the senior footman and the butler. You watched, you asked questions, you made mistakes and got yelled at, and eventually you figured it out. Some tasks required more training. A lady's maid needed to know how to dress hair in elaborate styles, how to care for fine fabrics, how to make minor repairs to clothes. She might have learned these skills from her mother if she came from a family of servants, or from a previous mistress who trained her up from a housemaid position. Valets needed to know how to shave their employer without cutting him, how to clean and maintain clothing, how to tie elaborate cravats. Again, this was learned from experience. The higher-level servants, butler, housekeeper, steward, usually worked their way up. They started in lower positions and proved themselves capable, reliable, and trustworthy. By the time you became a housekeeper, you'd been in service for 20 years and knew how everything worked. Some families preferred to train their servants from young, feeling this created loyalty and ensured the servants knew exactly how that household wanted things done. Other families hired experienced servants who'd worked elsewhere.
References were crucial. When you left a position, you needed a character reference from your employer. Without a good reference, finding a new position was nearly impossible. This gave employers a lot of power over servants. If a servant complained about mistreatment or left on bad terms, the employer could refuse to give a reference or give a bad one, effectively ending their servant's career. This meant servants often had to put up with awful conditions because they couldn't afford to leave without a reference. Some employers were fair and would give honest references. Others used the system to control their servants. Be obedient and never complain, or I'll ruin your future employment prospects. It was a system ripe for abuse. Now let's talk about the economics of being a servant, because the pay was not great. Wages varied widely depending on the position, location, and employer. At the low end, a scullery maid might make 3 or 4 pounds a year. At the high end, a butler or housekeeper in a grand household might make 50 or 60 pounds a year, plus room and board. That might sound like a huge range, but consider that room and board were included. You didn't pay rent, didn't buy food, so your wages could be saved in theory. In practice, servants needed to buy their own clothes, except livery, maybe personal items, maybe send home to family, so savings were minimal for lower servants.
Upper servants could actually save significant amounts. A butler who saved carefully over a career might retire with enough money to open a small shop or inn. A housekeeper might have enough to live modestly in her old age. But lower servants were basically living paycheck to paycheck, or more accurately, year to year, since many were paid annually or quarterly. Some employers were terrible about actually paying wages. They'd delay, make excuses, maybe pay in goods instead of money. Servants had little recourse. You couldn't exactly sue your employer. You'd just have to wait and hope to get paid eventually. There are records of servants who were owed years of back wages, unable to leave because they'd have nothing, unable to save because they weren't being paid, trapped in a system that exploited them. Other employers paid promptly and fairly, but they were the exception rather than the rule. Servants also sometimes received vails, which were tips from guests. If the family hosted a house party, the guests would tip the servants who attended to them. This could add up to a decent amount and was an expected perk of certain positions. Footmen and ladies' maids often did well from vails. But this practice became controversial in the later 18th century. Some employers felt it was undignified and banned it, which meant servants lost a significant source of income. Let's talk about old age and retirement, because servants didn't work forever. If you were lucky and had a generous employer, you might be pensioned off in old age, allowed to retire with a small annual income. Some estates had pensioners' cottages where retired servants could live. But this was far from guaranteed. Many servants worked until they physically couldn't anymore, then were just let go. If they'd saved money, they might scrape by. If not, they'd end up in a workhouse, which was basically the worst-case scenario. Workhouses were grim institutions where the poor and destitute did hard labor in exchange for minimal food and shelter. Some servants tried to work until they died because that way they at least had food and shelter. There are records of elderly servants in their 70s still working, doing light tasks, kept on out of charity or loyalty. Servants who'd been with a family for decades sometimes developed genuine relationships with their employers. They might be remembered in wills, left a small bequest or annuity. This could make the difference between a comfortable old age and destitution. Family members sometimes helped each other. A servant who'd done well might help support aging parents or siblings might pool resources to care for elderly parents.
But there was no social safety net, no pension system, no social security. You relied on savings, family, employer's charity, or you ended up in the workhouse. Let's float over to religious observance, because religion was woven into daily life in ways that might seem strange to us now. Sunday was the Sabbath, and servants were expected to attend church. This was often their only guaranteed time away from work, though, as we mentioned, it was staggered, so someone was always available to tend to the household. Church attendance was pretty much mandatory. Even if you weren't particularly religious, you went because that's what everyone did. Not going would mark you as strange or immoral. Servants usually sat in the back of the church or in a separate section from the gentry. The class hierarchy extended even to where you sat in church. The wealthy families had their own pews, often with cushions and good sight lines. Servants stood or sat on hard benches in the back. The household would often have daily prayers as well. The family and servants would gather, usually in the morning, for a short prayer session. The master or mistress would read from the Bible, lead prayers, and then everyone would go about their day.
This was partly about genuine religious devotion and partly about social control. Having servants participate in household prayers reinforced the idea that everyone had their place in God's ordained hierarchy. The master was the head of the household, just as God was the head of the universe. Servants should be obedient to their earthly masters as they were to their heavenly one. Some employers were genuinely pious and cared about the spiritual welfare of their servants. They'd ensure servants had Bibles, could attend church, observed holy days. Others just went through the motions because it was expected. Religious holidays meant different things for different people. Christmas meant a brief respite for servants, maybe some gifts, extra food. Easter, Whitsun, other holy days might come with a day off, or at least lighter duties. Fast days were supposed to mean no meat, which actually simplified cooking somewhat, though by the 18th century, many people weren't strict about fasting. Let's talk about communication, because keeping in touch with family or friends when you were in service was difficult. If you could write, you could send letters, but postage was expensive and charged to the recipient, not the sender. So sending a letter meant your family had to pay to receive it, which they might not be able to afford. Some servants arranged for letters to be sent with travelers heading in the right direction, avoiding postage. Or they'd write rarely, maybe once or twice a year. If you couldn't write, which many lower servants couldn't, you relied on word of mouth. You'd ask someone traveling near your home village to carry a message, or you'd just lose touch with family for years. The isolation was real. A young servant who'd left home to work in a city might not see family for years, might not even know if something had happened to parents or siblings until long after the fact. Within the household, communication was mostly verbal and immediate.
The mistress would tell the housekeeper what she wanted, the housekeeper would tell the maids, and everyone would scramble to make it happen. There might be a household bell system in fancy houses. Different rooms had bell pulls that would ring bells in the servants' area, with indicators showing which room was calling. A servant would see the bell for the drawing room ringing and hurry up to see what was needed.
Some households had speaking tubes, pipes that carried voices between floors. You'd speak into a tube in the drawing room and be heard in the servants' hall below. Primitive but functional. Otherwise, you sent a footman or maid running to deliver messages. Tell cook dinner will be at 4 instead of 3. Off goes the servant to relay the message. Let's drift into the topic of transportation and travel, because when the family traveled, it was a whole production. We mentioned the family moving between country estate and London townhouse, but there were also other trips: visiting relatives, taking the waters at Bath or another spa town, going on a tour of the continent if you were very wealthy. The family traveled in relative comfort in their carriage, but the servants had a much rougher time. Some might ride in a second carriage or in a cart with the luggage. Others walked or rode on the outside of the carriage. Long trips took days or weeks. You'd stop at coaching inns along the way. The family would get rooms, meals, comfortable beds. The servants would sleep in the stables or in shared attic rooms, eat leftover scraps, and be expected to be ready to attend the family at any moment.
Once you arrived at your destination, if you were staying with another family, the servants had to navigate the social hierarchy of the host's servants. There could be friction. Whose servant had precedence? Who got the better sleeping spots? The lady's maid might clash with the resident housekeeper. It was all very complicated and probably exhausting for everyone involved. Some servants loved traveling because it broke up the monotony. You got to see new places, even if you were working the whole time. Others hated it because it was uncomfortable, disorienting, and often meant even more work than usual. If the family went abroad, which wealthy families sometimes did, they'd take a few essential servants: a valet, a lady's maid, maybe a footman. The rest would stay home to maintain the estate. Traveling abroad meant dealing with language barriers, different customs, foreign money. The servants had to figure it all out while also doing their jobs. Stressful, to say the least. Now let's talk about the weird, specific little tasks that don't fit into any neat category, but took up time nonetheless. Someone had to wind all the clocks. Big houses had multiple clocks that needed wound regularly, usually weekly. This was often the butler's job. He'd make his rounds with the clock keys, winding each one. Someone had to trim the wicks on candles and lamps. Wicks would get charred and needed trimming to keep the flame stay. This was constant maintenance. Someone had to blacken the stoves and grates. The metal would rust and look ugly, so there was special black lead paste that you'd rub on to make it look nice and dark. This was messy, smelly work. Someone had to turn the mattresses, regularly flipping and rotating mattresses to keep them from getting lumpy. Someone had to air out rooms that weren't being used, open windows, let fresh air circulate, prevent mildew and mustiness. Someone had to catch and deal with mice and rats. Before modern pest control, rodents were a constant problem. Cats helped,
But you also had traps and sometimes had to dispose of dead rodents. Charming.
Someone had to manage the ice house if the estate had one. Ice houses were underground structures where ice cut from ponds in winter was stored, insulated with straw. You could have ice in summer for cold drinks or food preservation. But managing it, cutting the ice, storing it, retrieving it, was labor-intensive. Someone had to maintain the family's wardrobe against moths. Cedar chests helped, but you also had to regularly check stored clothing, air things out, maybe use moth deterrents like lavender or tobacco. Someone had to prepare hot water bottles on cold nights. These were ceramic or metal bottles filled with boiling water, wrapped in cloth, and put in the bed to warm it up. Because climbing into a freezing bed was miserable. Someone had to lay out and maintain the family's wigs and hairpieces if they wore them. Wigs needed to be powdered, styled, stored properly. The powder was usually made from starch and had to be applied carefully. The whole wig culture of the 18th century was elaborate and kind of absurd. Actually, let's linger on wigs for a moment, because they were such a thing. Men of a certain class wore wigs. These ranged from small, neat ones to enormous powdered creations. The wigs were made from human hair, horsehair, or sometimes goat hair. They were expensive and required maintenance.
A gentleman's valet would care for his wigs, brush them, powder them, style them, repair them if they got damaged. The powdering was done in a special closet or small room because the powder went everywhere. The gentleman would put on a cone over his face to protect it, and the valet would puff clouds of powder over the wig until it was properly white. Why white? Fashion, basically. It looked elegant and sophisticated. Never mind that it was impractical and messy. Women also wore hairpieces and used powder, though styles varied. Some women had their natural hair styled elaborately and powdered. Others wore wigs or added false hair to bulk up their styles. The elaborate hairstyles you see in paintings from the 18th century, those could take hours to create and were sometimes left up for days or even weeks, which meant sleeping carefully, not being able to wash your hair, and probably hosting a variety of small insects in there. There are stories of women's hairstyles becoming nests for mice or lice, though how true those are is debatable. Either way, hair care was a whole job, and ladies' maids spent a lot of time on it. Let's talk about entertainment from the servant's perspective.
Servants didn't have a lot of free time, but they found ways to entertain themselves. In the servants' hall, there might be singing, storytelling, card games, dice. These had to be done quietly and quickly during brief breaks. On their half-day off, servants might go to a fair, visit family if they lived nearby, attend a dance or social event for working-class people. Romances often started during these outings. Servants from different households would meet and court. Reading, if you were literate, was another pastime. Cheap pamphlets, broadsheets, sensational stories. The literacy rate was rising during the 18th century, and servants who could read might share materials, passing around a pamphlet until it fell apart. Some employers allowed servants to borrow books from the household library, though this wasn't common. More often, servants read whatever they could get their hands on: old newspapers,
religious tracts, maybe a novel if they were lucky. Drinking was a common pastime. Ale, gin, cheap wine. Some servants drank too much, as we mentioned, because it was one of the few pleasures available and helped numb the exhaustion and monotony. Gossip was free entertainment. Servants knew all the family's secrets and would share them among themselves. Who was having an affair? Who was in debt? Who was planning to fire whom? The below-stairs gossip network was extensive and surprisingly accurate.
All right, we've wandered through a lot of territory here. The regional differences, the seasonal rhythms, the endless parade of specific tasks. Running a household in the 18th century was a constant, grinding effort involving dozens of people doing hundreds of tasks, most of which we now do with machines or don't do at all. And we're still not done. There's more to talk about. The changes that were starting to happen toward the end of the century, the technological innovations slowly creeping in, the social shifts that would eventually transform this entire system. So, stay comfortable, let your mind drift, and let's keep exploring this exhausting historical landscape.
All right, we're in the home stretch now. Let's ease into the final leg of this journey through 18th century household management. We're going to talk about the changes that started creeping in toward the end of the century, the technological shifts that were barely beginning, and what all of this actually meant for the real people living through it. So, adjust that pillow one last time, settle in deep, and let's drift through the twilight of the 1700s. One thing that's important to understand is that the 18th century wasn't static. The year 1700 looked different from 1750, which looked different from 1799. Changes were happening, slowly, almost imperceptibly, but they were there. Technology was beginning to shift, even if most households wouldn't see the benefits for decades. The Industrial Revolution was rumbling to life in Britain, starting in the textile mills and coal mines, and it would eventually transform domestic life too. But in the 18th century, much of that was still in the future. Still, there were little innovations. Improved stove designs started appearing in the later part of the century. The closed stove, which was more efficient than an open hearth, began to be used in some wealthy households. It gave better temperature control, used less fuel, and didn't fill the room with smoke. But it was expensive, so most households stuck with what they knew. Range ovens started to appear too, early versions of the kitchen ranges that would become standard in the 19th century. These were built into the wall and had multiple surfaces for cooking. Revolutionary for a cook who was used to managing everything over an open fire, but again, expensive and newfangled. Most cooks in the 18th century worked with open hearths their entire careers. Water closets, early flush toilets started to show up in some wealthy homes toward the end of the century. These were primitive compared to modern toilets. They connected to cesspits, or, if you were very advanced, to a sewer system. They leaked, they smelled, they broke constantly, but they were better than chamber pots, so wealthy families started installing them.
For servants, this meant a new thing to clean and maintain. The water closet still needed to be scrubbed. Someone had to make sure there was water in the cistern. Someone had to deal with it when it clogged or overflowed, which was often. So, progress, but also more work. Lamps improved too.
The argand lamp, invented in the 1780s, gave much better light than candles or traditional oil lamps. It had a circular wick and a glass chimney that made the flame brighter and steadier. Wealthy households started using them. But they still used oil, still needed cleaning, still required constant maintenance. For every technological improvement, there was a new task for servants. Better lamps meant cleaning glass chimneys daily. Water closets meant new cleaning routines. Improved stoves meant learning new cooking techniques. Progress didn't mean less work, it just meant different work. Let's talk about what was happening socially, because attitudes were slowly shifting. The Enlightenment was happening. People were starting to question traditional hierarchies, to think about individual rights, human dignity, all that good stuff. This didn't immediately translate to better conditions for servants, but the seeds were being planted. Some writers and thinkers started arguing that servants should be treated better, paid fairly, given more respect. This was radical at the time. The idea that servants were human beings who deserved dignity was not universally accepted.
Religious movements like Methodism emphasized that all souls were equal before God, which challenged the rigid class hierarchy. Methodist preachers would address servants and laborers directly, telling them they had worth, that God cared about them. This was powerful stuff for people who'd been told their entire lives that they existed to serve their betters. Some employers started treating servants a bit better, not out of the goodness of their hearts necessarily, but because there was a growing sense that happy servants worked better. Enlightened self-interest, basically. Servant registries and employment agencies started appearing in cities. These were businesses that matched servants looking for work with families looking to hire. It professionalized the hiring process a bit, though it also created new opportunities for exploitation. Some registries charged servants fees to be listed, which ate into their tiny wages. Books started being published about household management, giving advice to housewives and housekeepers. These books laid out proper routines, recommended recipes, advised on servant management. They were the lifestyle blogs of their day, basically. One of the most famous was Hannah Glass's The Art of Cookery Made Plain and Easy, published in 1747. It was aimed at teaching cooks and housewives how to prepare food efficiently. Glass wrote in a clear, practical style and included advice on running a kitchen, managing expenses, and dealing with servants. These books reveal a lot about attitudes of the time. They often talk about servants as if they're slightly dim children who need constant supervision. Make sure your cook doesn't waste the drippings. Keep the keys to the pantry yourself or the maids will steal. There's this underlying assumption that servants couldn't be trusted. Some books were more sympathetic, acknowledging that servants worked hard and deserved fair treatment. But even the sympathetic ones still saw servants as fundamentally different, a separate class of people. Let's talk about what happened when things went wrong in a household, because disasters did happen. Fire was a constant threat, with open flames everywhere, hearth fires, candles, lamps, and no fire extinguishers or fire departments as we know them. Fires were terrifying and common. If a fire started, everyone in the household would scramble to put it out. Bucket brigades, throwing water, trying to smother flames with wet blankets. Sometimes it worked. Sometimes the whole house burned down. There are records of great houses burning to the ground because a candle tipped over or sparks from a fire caught a curtain. Entire families lost their homes and possessions. Servants sometimes died fighting fires or escaping them. It was a real, visceral danger.
Wealthy families might rebuild, though it would cost a fortune. Servants who lost their positions in a fire had to find new work, which wasn't always easy.
Flooding was another disaster, especially in areas near rivers. If a river flooded, ground floor rooms would be inundated. Servants would have to rush to move furniture, carry valuables upstairs, try to protect what they could. Afterward, there would be days or weeks of cleanup, mud everywhere, water damage, ruined items. Everything would have to be tried out, cleaned, repaired. Theft was a constant low-level problem. Burglars might break in, especially in cities. Servants were often the first line of defense. They might hear something, investigate, raise the alarm. Some servants were hurt or scared during break-ins. More common was petty theft by people who visited the house. Tradesmen, guests' servants, even guests themselves might pocket small items. The household staff had to keep an eye on everything, which added another layer of vigilance to their already exhausting jobs. Serious illness in the household could be devastating. If the master or mistress died, the entire household's future was uncertain. Would the heir keep them on? Would the house be sold? Servants might suddenly find themselves unemployed through no fault of their own. If an epidemic came through, and they did regularly, it could wipe out half the household. Servants living in close quarters were especially vulnerable. Some employers fled to the countryside at the first sign of disease, leaving a skeleton crew of servants to maintain the townhouse. Those servants had to choose between staying and risking illness or leaving and losing their livelihood. It was a harsh calculus. Stay and maybe die, or leave and definitely lose your livelihood.
Let's drift over to the American colonies for a bit, because household management there had its own peculiarities. In the colonies, especially in the earlier part of the 18th century, there were fewer servants in the traditional sense. Labor was scarce, so wages were higher. Many households that in England would have had multiple servants made do with one or two, or even none. Indentured servants were common, people who'd agreed to work for a certain number of years in exchange for passage to America. They were technically not slaves, but they had no freedom during their term of service. They could be bought and sold, punished, prevented from marrying. It was a rough existence. After their term was up, indentured servants were free and sometimes given a small plot of land or a bit of money to start their new life. Some did well, others struggled, finding that freedom without resources wasn't much better than servitude. In the American South, enslaved people did most of the household labor on plantations. This was a completely different and infinitely more brutal system than paid servants. Enslaved people had no wages, no freedom, no hope of working their way up or retiring comfortably. They were property, and their lives were controlled completely by their enslavers. The household management books written for plantation mistresses are deeply unsettling to read. They talk about managing enslaved people with the same tone they'd use for managing livestock: efficient, cold, focused on extracting maximum labor. This is a much darker topic than the rest of what we've been discussing, and it's important to acknowledge that when we talk about household management in the 18th century, we're often talking about systems built on exploitation, whether of poor free servants or enslaved people. In the northern colonies and later the early United States, the system looked more like England: paid servants, though fewer of them. Middle-class families might have one servant, a maid of all work, who did everything.
She'd cook, clean, do laundry, help with children, basically run the household with minimal help. This was brutally hard work. Being the only servant meant no one to share the load, no days off because there was no one to cover for you. But it also meant more autonomy. You weren't at the bottom of a hierarchy, you were the whole staff. Some women preferred it, others found it isolating and exhausting. Let's talk about Scotland and Ireland because they had their own variations on household management. In Scotland, Highland estates operated somewhat differently than English ones. The clan system was breaking down by the 18th century, but there were still echoes of it. Servants might be from families that had served the laird's family for generations. There was a sense of mutual obligation, though this didn't necessarily mean servants were treated better.
Scottish households had their own traditional dishes and routines. Oatmeal featured heavily in the diet. Whiskey was the drink of choice rather than wine. The climate was harsher, winters longer, which meant different preservation techniques and fuel management. In Ireland, the 18th century was a time of intense poverty for the majority of the population. The Anglo-Irish aristocracy lived in grand estates with large staffs, but the majority of Irish people were tenant farmers living on the edge of survival. Irish servants often worked for Anglo-Irish Protestant families, and there was a complex dynamic of class mixed with ethnic and religious tension. Catholic Irish servants working for Protestant English landowners, often speaking Irish among themselves while speaking English to their employers. Irish estates produced a lot of linen, and some households had their own spinning and weaving operations. Servants might be involved in textile production as well as regular household tasks. The potato became a staple crop in Ireland in the 18th century, and it would sustain the population until the catastrophic failure of the potato crop in the 1840s. But in the 18th century, it was a miracle food, easy to grow, nutritious, could feed a family on a small plot of land. Servants' diets in Ireland often centered on potatoes, buttermilk, and oatmeal. Let's come back to England and talk about the end of the century, because things were starting to shift in ways that would accelerate in the 19th century.
The French Revolution happened in 1789, and it sent shockwaves through Europe. The idea that the common people could rise up and overthrow the aristocracy was terrifying to the upper classes. Suddenly, treating servants badly seemed potentially dangerous. There was increased paranoia about servants as potential revolutionaries. Were they plotting? Were they resentful? Some employers became more cautious, more aware that their comfortable lives depended on the labor and cooperation of people they'd been taking for granted. At the same time, there was a backlash. Some aristocracies doubled down on the hierarchy, insisting on even more elaborate displays of deference and control. If the world was changing, they'd resist by making their households even more rigidly traditional. The population was growing. More people meant more potential servants, which meant wages could be kept low because there was always someone desperate enough to take a position. Urbanization was increasing, more people moving to cities away from rural life. This created a growing servant class in urban areas. People who'd left the country looking for opportunity and ended up in service because it was the most accessible employment. The gap between rich and poor was widening. The very wealthy were getting wealthier, building even grander houses, employing even larger staffs. Meanwhile, the poor were getting poorer, more desperate, more willing to work for low wages in bad conditions.
It's a pattern that repeats throughout history, really. Economic change creates winners and losers, and the losers usually have very little power to change their circumstances. Let's talk about the rare moments of genuine connection and even joy in the servant's life, because it wasn't all misery. Some servants did develop real affection for the families they served, especially if they'd been with them for years. They'd watch children grow up, share in family celebrations, feel a sense of pride in the household's success. Some employers genuinely cared for their servants, knew their families, helped in times of trouble. There are records of employers paying for a servant's medical care, helping a servant's child get an apprenticeship, attending a long-time servant's funeral. These weren't equal relationships. They couldn't be, given the power dynamics, but they could be warm in their own way. Servants formed friendships with each other. The servants' hall could be a place of camaraderie, shared jokes, mutual support, someone to complain to who understood. These relationships sustained people through hard times.
Romances, marriages, families. Servants fell in love, got married, though often they had to leave service to do so, as many employers didn't allow married servants. They had children, built lives outside of their work, even if those lives were constrained by poverty and long hours. There were small pleasures, a well-cooked meal shared in the kitchen, a song sung while working, a rare afternoon off spent at a fair or visiting a friend. These moments of lightness existed even in hard lives. Some servants took pride in their work. A cook who created a perfect dish. A footman who served flawlessly at an important dinner. A housekeeper whose domain ran like clockwork. Professional pride is a real thing, even in difficult circumstances. And some servants did eventually escape into better lives. A maid who married above her station, a footman who saved enough to start a business, a lady's maid whose employer left her a bequest that allowed her to retire comfortably. These were rare, but they happened, and they represented hope. Let's acknowledge the toll, though, because it was significant. Servants died young. Hard labor, poor living conditions, inadequate medical care, exposure to disease, all of this meant servants had lower life expectancy than the people they served.
We don't have comprehensive statistics, but records suggest that servants, especially lower servants, might expect to live into their 40s or 50s if they were lucky. Many died younger. Accidents, illness, childbirth complications for women, wear and tear on bodies subjected to relentless physical labor. The psychological toll was real, too. The constant deference, the lack of autonomy, the invisibility, having to suppress your own personality, your own needs, your own dignity to serve someone else day after day, year after year. That damages a person.
Some servants became depressed, though that word wasn't used then. They'd become listless, unable to cope. Others became bitter and hard. Some turned to alcohol or other escapes. The lack of family life was painful for many. Women who went into service often didn't marry, didn't have their own children, because there was no time, no opportunity. They'd spend their lives caring for other people's children, managing other people's homes. Male servants faced similar constraints. Footmen were often forbidden to marry while in service. By the time they aged out of footman positions and might have more freedom, they were middle-aged, set in their ways, and the opportunity for family might have passed. The isolation from their birth families was hard. Siblings growing up without them, parents aging and dying while they were far away, missing weddings, christenings, funerals, knowing that life was going on without them and they couldn't be part of it.
And yet, people endured. They survived. They found ways to make meaning in their lives. Humans are remarkably resilient, capable of finding small joys even in constrained circumstances. Let's talk about what happened to this system, because it didn't last forever. The 19th century would bring huge changes. The Victorian era saw the peak of the servant-keeping culture, but also the beginning of its decline. Technology slowly started to reduce the need for servants. Middle-class families started to do more for themselves as labor-saving devices became available. The two world wars in the 20th century would essentially end the old servant system. So many people were pulled into war work, into factories, into new opportunities. After experiencing independence and better pay, people didn't want to go back into service. By the mid-20th century, the grand households with huge staffs were mostly gone. Some survived in reduced form, but the world of the 18th century household with its armies of servants and rigid hierarchies had faded into history. We can see echoes of it in period dramas, in historic houses preserved as museums, in the upstairs-downstairs fantasies we still find compelling. But the reality was so much more complex, more exhausting, more human than the sanitized versions we usually see.
So what did it mean to run a household in the 18th century? It meant coordinating the labor of many people to accomplish tasks that seem absurdly simple to us now. Keeping things clean, people fed, clothes washed. It meant navigating complex social hierarchies, managing limited resources, dealing with primitive technology. For the people at the top, it meant maintaining status, demonstrating wealth, managing estates and servants like a business. It was often more about display than comfort. For the people at the bottom, the servants, it meant long hours, hard work, very little freedom, and minimal reward. It meant doing essential work while being treated as essentially invisible. It meant sacrifice, endurance, making the best of limited options. The 18th century household was a microcosm of the larger society, hierarchical, unequal, built on the labor of the many to support the comfort of the few. It functioned in its way, but at a significant human cost. Understanding this system helps us understand how people lived, what they valued, what they endured. It's easy to romanticize the past, to imagine elegant ladies and dashing gentlemen in beautiful clothes living refined lives. But behind that elegance were exhausted servants hauling water upstairs, scrubbing floors on their knees, working themselves to early graves so that someone else could look refined.
It's important to remember that, to honor the reality of those lives.
To understand that history isn't just kings and battles and grand events. It's also the everyday grind, the ordinary people doing extraordinary amounts of work, the quiet tragedies and small victories. The 18th century household was all of that, complex, exhausting, fascinating in its details, and troubling in its inequalities. It was a world that's gone now, swept away by time and change, but it shaped the world that came after, and its echoes remain. And so we come to the end of our long, meandering journey through the daily life of running a household in the 1700s. We've covered the hierarchies, the tasks, the tools, the seasonal rhythms, the regional variations, the technological beginnings, the social shifts, and the human cost. We've wandered through kitchens and bedrooms, laundry rooms and gardens, servants' halls and grand dining rooms. It's been a lot, I know. Hopefully, it's been the kind of a lot that's helped ease you towards sleep, that's filled your mind with details about the past while letting your body relax into rest. The world has changed so much since then. We have machines to do our laundry, electricity to light our homes, running water at the turn of a tap, heat at the push of a button. We don't need armies of servants to maintain basic comfort. In some ways, we're all living like kings compared to even wealthy people of the 18th century. But in other ways, the fundamental things haven't changed. People still work hard. Inequality still exists. Some people still do the hard, invisible labor that makes other people's lives comfortable. The details are different, but the patterns persist. Anyway, that's enough philosophizing for one night. We've reached the end of our story about what it meant to run a household in the 18th century. It's been a long journey through a world of chamber pots and coal fires, of endless staircases and relentless routines, of human resilience and quiet suffering. I hope you found it interesting, or at least pleasantly sleep-inducing. May your dreams be free of chamber pots and your rest be deep and untroubled by the need to haul buckets of water up 3 flights of stairs. Sleep well, friends, until next time, when we'll dive into another slice of history's weird, exhausting, fascinating details. Good night.